What's up everyone, Erik here from Hardware for Gamers, and this is part 3 of how to set up a new PC. This is where I'm going to go through and check the system performance and its temperatures, and after that, if everything looks good, I'll go through and show you how to custom tune the system. Now this could mean overclocking and or undervolting the CPU and or GPU. I will also go over on how to make sure that everything is stable. Now to check the system temperatures, you will need some sort of monitoring software, something like HWMonitor from CPUID or HWMonitor. Both of these softwares are free and links will be in the description below. I personally use HWMonitor mainly because I can actually save a CSV file to look through all the data. And you can also choose what hardware is actually being shown, which actually makes things a little easier to read, especially when you save that CSV file. Now you can do something similar on HWMonitor, but that's only with the Pro version, which you then have to go buy. For this testing, I'm really only going to be looking at the motherboard, the CPU, and the GPU. So if you are using HWMonitor, you can just remove the hardware from the list. Okay, now that the monitoring software is set up, we need something to test. I like using Blender to test the CPU temperatures and its stability. Blender is free and a link to the download is in the description below. And so that I actually have something to render, I also download a demo file. I like using the barbershop scene, but you can choose whichever one you want. To test the gaming temperatures, I like to use 3D Mark's Firestrike. The basic version of Firestrike is free and can be downloaded through Steam. Okay, and before we start testing, I am going to actually restart my computer and jump into the BIOS to set my fans. I'm doing this because I'm testing the CPU and GPU temperatures, so making sure that the fans are set to a reasonable speed is actually pretty important. Now when doing this testing, I recommend setting the fans to a set speed based off of the loudest volume or the loudest noise level that you're comfortable with. Once I'm done, I save the settings and boot back into Windows. I'm going to start with Blender. I already have it downloaded, so I'm now going to install it. Once Blender is installed, I simply just open the demo file to launch Blender, and once it's done loading, I start up HWMonitor. I'm also going to actually start a sensor log. Now back in Blender, press F12 to render the scene. This barbershop render should take about 20 or so minutes. Now the point of running this test is to see what the CPU baseline temperature is on the default settings. And that will help us know on if we can or should overclock the CPU, or maybe instead undervolting it, depending on what the temperatures actually come out to be. The render is now done. It took pretty much 21 minutes and 34 seconds. I'm going to stop the log file and rename it. So my CPU was running at 3675 megahertz and was pulling about 1.28 volts. And the max temperature only hit 53 Celsius. Now this temperature that I'm getting really doesn't concern me. It actually indicates that I have a lot of headroom to play with. The maximum thermal limit of Intel and AMD CPUs are different, and they'll be different between generations as well. But a good rule of thumb is to try to make sure that your CPU temperature doesn't get over 90 Celsius. Now, if your CPU temperature is over 90 Celsius, then you're probably going to want to increase your fan speeds, or there may be something actually wrong, like the mounting pressure of the CPU cooler, or maybe you didn't put enough thermal paste on the CPU. Now, it is possible that the airflow in your case may also just suck. I'm going to start up 3D Mark now and test the gaming temperatures. I'm going to run Firestrike in a loop for about 15 to 20 minutes, and I'm going to save a sensor log using HWMonitor. But before starting the test, I recommend setting the video card fans to a set speed, again based off of the loudest noise level that you're comfortable with. Okay, it's been 20 minutes. I'm going to stop the log file and rename it. Now I'm actually going to take a look at the log file because you can't actually see the temperatures as Firestrike is running. I recommend opening it in Google Sheets or Excel. So now actually looking in Google Sheets, I can see that the GPU is running at around 1730 megahertz, with the memory running at 1750 megahertz. As far as I can tell, the max temperature for the hotspot was at 76 Celsius, and the maximum temperature for the memory was 74 Celsius. Again, none of these temperatures concern me, but again, if any of these temperatures are at or above 90 Celsius, then you may need to increase the fan speed of your video card. You can also try increasing the fan speed of the case to try to exhaust that hot air out. It is also possible that there could be something actually wrong with the video card, like bad mounting pressure or even a bad component, so you'd actually have to return it. Again, it's also possible that your case airflow may just suck, and doesn't matter how hard you push your fans, it's still not going to exhaust that hot air properly. Now with the temperature testing out of the way, and if everything looks good, I recommend running the Firestrike benchmark to see how you score. And it does seem that my system is running exactly as it should be. So now it's time to actually start custom tuning the system. And again, depending on what your results were, this could involve overclocking and or undervolting the GPU and CPU. The difference between overclocking and undervolting, simply put, is overclocking is increasing the system performance by increasing the power, which in turn increases the amount of heat that the CPU will put out. And undervolting maintains stock performance at a lower temperature. Now, by how much really all depends on the quality of the silicon of the CPU and or GPU. You may have heard of the term the silicon lottery, which refers to how far and how well the chip can actually be pushed beyond its stock settings. This limit will be different for every chip, which is where the term winning the silicon lottery comes from. Now, in most cases, people will want to be overclocking, but depending on the use case of the system, like if you're trying to actually set up a home theater PC, you may actually want to think about undervolting your CPU and GPU, because doing so will lower the temperatures and noise level. Now, I'll be showing you how to overclock and undervolt an AMD Ryzen CPU using the UEFI BIOS. And before you start anything, just a quick note, you do need to understand that overclocking and undervolting is trial and error. So to get everything safe and stable can take a very long time. And it's always a good idea to actually check your motherboard manual to see where the clear CMOS button and or jumper is before you start, just in case something goes wrong and you can't actually get back into the BIOS. Now, depending on the motherboard, this might work a little differently, or at least look a little different. And best practices when overclocking and undervolting is to make small adjustments to the voltage and then go into Windows and run your stress test. As before, I'm going to be using Blender to actually stress the CPU. If the CPU finishes the render, then you restart the computer, go back into the BIOS, and drop the voltage. You do this until it crashes, and when it does crash, all you do is go back into the BIOS and raise the voltage, then try running the render again. Now, how to actually overclock a CPU is pretty simple. All you really need to do is change the CPU ratio. On some motherboards, they do call this the multiplier. The way it works is the CPU frequency is the CPU ratio times the base clock, which is 100. Now, some motherboards may have you put in the CPU frequency instead of the CPU ratio, but the principle still is pretty much the same. In that case, they'll just be dividing it by 100 in the background. Now, just changing the CPU ratio doesn't mean that it's actually going to work, because the CPU will likely need more voltage to actually be able to achieve that new clock speed. Now, it is possible to set the CPU ratio and leave the voltage on auto, but I don't recommend doing this, because having the motherboard in control of the voltage will likely mean that it's going to be using a lot more voltage than is actually needed, and this will lead to a hotter CPU. Now, depending on your motherboard, the way to set the CPU voltage can be either by override and or by offset. I do have a video on how to overclock a Ryzen CPU using offset. I'll leave a card up above. Now, when overclocking a Ryzen CPU, it is recommended that you don't go over 1.4 volts. And I don't even recommend going to 1.4 volts. Now, when undervolting, you leave the CPU ratio on auto and set the CPU core voltage. I find it easier to undervolt using offset rather than override. Okay, so for the system that I'm setting up, I'm going to be going for a 4.1 gigahertz or a 4100 megahertz overclock. And I'm going to start with the voltage at 1.3875. Then I'm going to save these settings and boot into Windows. Run a render using Blender. I'm also going to monitor the temperatures using HWMonitor. Okay, so my CPU was able to finish the render, so I'm gonna go back into the BIOS and drop the voltage, save the settings, boot back into Windows, run the render again, and again, I'm gonna monitor the temperatures using HWMonitor. Okay, so my CPU was able to finish the render again. So again, I'm gonna go back into the BIOS and drop the voltage, get back into Windows, run the render. Okay, so this time it did fail. Now, failed results can look different. Blender could crash to desktop like it did just for me. or the system could go to black screen, which means you're going to have to restart the system, or it's possible that the system just then restarts all by itself. Now, as I said before, if the render does crash, then all you need to do is go back into the BIOS and raise the voltage. And once the CPU is stable at a voltage, you can go back into the BIOS and then enable the XMP profile of the RAM, save the settings, boot back into Windows, and run the renderer all again. Now the reason we're doing this is because having the RAM overclocked or the XMP profile on will actually increase the temperature of the CPU, which then can make the CPU become unstable, which means that you want to make sure that the CPU has adequate cooling. If you are having issues getting the render to finish, then you may need to actually drop the CPU core ratio. Most motherboards will let you have a decimal, so you can do a 0.5, and many motherboards will actually let you even do a 0.25, so you can actually get a quarter step. Now once you have the CPU overclocked and the memory overclocked, it's then time to move on to the GPU. This system I'm setting up has an RX 5600 XT, and that's what I'll be using, so I'll be doing this on the AMD Radeon side. So if you do have an NVIDIA GPU or an older AMD GPU, this will be very similar but not the exact same. The biggest difference will be the software. For the newer AMD GPUs, it seems to work best when you're using the Radeon software. But for NVIDIA and the older AMD GPUs, I would recommend using something more along the lines of MSI's Afterburner. So I'm going to right click on the desktop and open up the Radeon software. I'm going to go over to the Performance tab. On the second set of tabs, select Tuning. Now it is possible just to have the software undervolt or overclock your GPU, but I'm going to actually show you how to do it manually. So under Tuning Control, select Manual. This will open up a whole bunch of different widgets. And under GPU Tuning, I select Enable, and then enable Advanced Controls, and then open the Fine Tuning Controls. So for the purpose of playing video games, we're only going to be modifying the third step. To overclock the GPU, you will need to increase the frequency and or voltage. I recommend just increasing the frequency at first. Once the GPU crashes to desktop, you can either pull back the core frequency, or you can then start increasing the core voltage to see how far your GPU can be pushed. And to undervolt, you will only be decreasing the voltage. Because of the BIOS on this card, it's already running at its pretty much max frequency, so I'll be undervolting this RX 5600 XT, and I'm going to be decreasing the voltage in 20 millivolt increments, and then I'll run a Firestrike loop for 5 minutes to see if it's stable. I'm going to do this until Firestrike no longer is stable, and then I'll bring the voltage up in 10 millivolt increments and run Firestrike in a 5-minute loop. Once you have the GPU stable, you would then typically move on to overclocking the VRAM. So you want to enable the VRAM tuning and move the slider to the right and run Firestrike in a loop after each increase. Now, a lot of the time when overclocking the VRAM, you won't actually get crashes. Instead, you'll see things like screen flickering and some weird horizontal lines on your display. And the further you go, you'll start getting drops in FPS. Once you think things are stable, run a Firestrike loop for 25 to 30 minutes to check the temperatures. Now, when overclocking or undervolting a video card, it's always a good idea to test different APIs and different games. Now, if you are following this process, you should be stable, and the last thing to do would be to actually go in and adjust the fans to actually have a proper profile rather than just being at a set speed. So when the computer is at idle, it should hopefully be pretty much silent. And that's all I got for this one. If you did like the video, please give it a thumbs up. And please hit that subscribe button. I'm trying to get to 1,000 subscribers so it actually can make some money on these videos. Please follow me on Twitter at HFG_YT. I also have the Discord server, so the link will be in the description below. And as always, thank you for watching, and see you next time.